For centuries, the lands of modern France had endured waves of turmoil. The fall of the Western Roman Empire had left the region fragmented, its rulers vying for dominance over the fractured territories. Yet, despite internal struggles, a greater threat loomed on the horizon. Emerging from the icy fjords of Scandinavia, a new breed of warrior had set their sights on the rich and fertile lands of Francia, seeking not just plunder, but permanence. Hello, and welcome to Impactful Moments, where we explore some of the most, you guessed it, impactful moments in human history. If history is your thing, or you simply enjoy learning new topics, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us to continue creating captivating, impactful, historical content. In this video, we will explore Rollo and the foundation of Normandy. In the late 8th century, Scandinavian sea raiders, known today as Vikings, began striking the coastlines of the North Atlantic. Their swift, agile ships allowed them to launch hit-and-run attacks on vulnerable settlements, particularly targeting the wealthy monasteries dotting the British coastline. These early Viking raids were primarily about wealth and plunder, with warriors arriving unexpectedly, seizing treasure, and vanishing before victims can mount a defense. However, as the 9th century progressed, both the Vikings and their victims adapted. What had once been quick and sporadic strikes evolved into prolonged engagements. At the same time, Viking ambitions also shifted. No longer content with just plunder, they sought to carve out their own territories. Viking settlements and fortified port cities sprang up throughout the North Atlantic, reaching as far as Iceland. By the end of the 9th century, the Norse warriors had occupied swaths of land, even establishing their own rule on the Anglo-Saxon island of Britain. While the Vikings were gaining ground along the coasts, mainland Europe was undergoing its own transformation. The Carolingian dynasty, through a series of powerful Frankish kings, had expanded its influence across much of the continent. Under Charlemagne, this empire grew to be the largest political entity in Europe since the fall of Rome. Charlemagne's military successes and leadership had also largely kept Scandinavian incursions at bay, securing the Frankish heartlands from sustained Viking aggression. After Charlemagne's death in 814, however, the Franks were increasingly seen as vulnerable, and Viking raids along the Frankish coastline and riverways resumed. By 820, Norse raiders were already striking deeper into the realm, launching attacks via the Seine and other major waterways. These incursions further intensified following the death of Louis the Pious in 840, as Carolingian unity truly began to fracture. With the empire divided among his heirs, West Francia under Charles the Bold found itself increasingly exposed, allowing Viking forces to push further inland and escalate their attacks with devastating effectiveness. A Viking siege of Paris in 845, which saw them walk away with a staggering 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, proved that the Frankish kingdom was willing to pay for peace. This set a dangerous precedent, one that the Viking warlords would be more than happy to exploit for decades. Raids along the Seine became an almost seasonal occurrence, each one further depleting the kingdom's wealth and reinforcing the notion that extortion was just as effective as battle. Charles the Bold, unable to mount a sustained resistance, repeatedly opted to pay off the invaders, a strategy that only emboldened them. By the 9th century, the Carolingian dynasty had fractured further. Charles the Bold died, and the Frankish throne eventually passed to Charles the Fat, a distant relative of his namesake. The new king would be quickly tested, and his weakness would be on full display when the Vikings returned to Paris in 885. This time, they came in overwhelming numbers. The siege of Paris saw Viking forces, led by Siegfried, attempt to batter the city into submission. However, the defense of Paris, commanded by Odo, Count of Paris, and Bishop Gozlin, became one of the most heroic stands in Frankish history. Though heavily outnumbered and facing starvation, Odo and Gozlin refused to surrender, repelling the Viking assaults for months. When Charles the Fat finally arrived with reinforcements, the people of Paris expected a decisive battle to drive the invaders away. Instead, to their horror, Charles paid the Vikings off, even encouraging them to raid the rebellious Burgundians who were situated deeper in Francia. This betrayal was too much. Charles was deposed the following year, and Odo was crowned king in 888. Yet the damage was done. The Vikings had once again secured their prize, and one of their leaders, Rollo, took full advantage. Free to continue his campaigns, Rollo settled along the Seine and led devastating raids up and down the river, carving out a growing domain. When Odo died in 898, the Frankish throne passed to yet another Charles, this time Charles the Simple. Unlike his predecessors, Charles managed to achieve some success against Viking incursions. While raids continued, none reached the devastating scale of those that plagued West Francia in the previous decades. However, the Viking threat remained ever present, and Charles knew that small military victories would not bring lasting peace. In 911, a Viking force, led by Rollo, laid siege to Chartres. This time, however, the Frankish defenders were well prepared. Charles's forces withstood the assault, outlasting the Viking warbands. But rather than allow these clashes to continue indefinitely, Charles saw an opportunity to end the conflict decisively. Instead of another cycle of raids and retaliation, he met with Rollo and proposed a radical solution. Charles offered Rollo control over the lands between the Seine and Rouen, a marshy region that had been devastated by decades of Viking raids and had been largely abandoned. Along with this territory, Charles offered his daughter, Gisla, in marriage, forging a political alliance. In return, Rollo agreed to convert to Christianity and, more importantly, to defend West Francia from future Viking incursions. Thus, the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte was signed. The lands granted to Rollo would eventually expand into the Duchy of Normandy, literally, Land of the Northmen. While the treaty secured some stability for West Francia, the new duchy would ultimately alter the course of European history. In the immediate years following the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, the agreement brought a measure of stability to West Francia. With Rollo and his warriors now acting as defenders rather than invaders, Viking raids along the Seine significantly decreased. The once devastated region around Rouen began to recover as settlers returned to abandoned lands under the protection of their new Norse ruler. Over the next several decades, the lands initially granted to Rollo expanded beyond Rouen, growing to encompass a much larger territory along the northern coast. As noted above, this expanded domain would become the Duchy of Normandy, so named for the Northmen who had once been its invaders and had now become its rulers. Though nominally a vassal of Charles the Simple, Rollo governed independently, enforcing strict rule over his new domain to establish his authority. As was the case with other Viking integrations across Europe, a new people emerged from this settlement. Much like the Rus in Eastern Europe and the Anglo-Viking towns of Britain, over time the fusion of Norse and Frankish cultures took root, creating a distinct identity. These Franco-Viking-blooded people, shaped by Frankish traditions and political structures, would become a powerful and influential subset of the Franks. In time, they would become known as the Normans, and their impact would be felt across the continent. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte may have started as a local agreement to curb Viking raids, but its consequences would ultimately reshape European history. What began as a pragmatic solution to a regional problem gave rise to one of medieval Europe's most formidable powers, the aforementioned Normans. Rollo, the towering Norse warlord known as the Walker because no horse could bear his weight, would establish a lineage that would soon reshape the political landscape of Europe. The treaty itself reportedly began with a moment of humiliation. When King Charles the Simple demanded that Rollo kiss his foot as a sign of fealty, the Viking leader refused, ordering one of his men to do it on his behalf. However, rather than bowing his head, the warrior lifted the king's foot, toppling him over. This foreshadowed a defining Norman trait. They would not submit as mere vassals, but would rule on their own terms. This independent and ambitious spirit allowed them not only to secure their foothold in Normandy, but also to extend their influence far beyond the lands first granted to Rollo. While the most famous Norman conquest was that of Rollo's great, several times over, grandson, William, the Duke of Normandy, better known as William the Conqueror, who defeated King Harold II in the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and claimed the English throne, their military campaigns stretched across Europe. The Normans became key players in the Crusades, carved out powerful territories in southern Italy, and even established the Kingdom of Sicily, where their fusion of cultures created a unique and influential society. Though the Normans, as a distinct people, no longer exists, their legacy certainly does. They were cultural blenders, merging their Norse heritage with the societies they conquered, leaving their mark on legal systems, architectural styles, and governance structures across Europe. Perhaps their most enduring impact, however, is the English language itself, where the linguistic changes introduced after 1066 in Britain helped shape the modern English spoken by billions around the world today. I hope you enjoyed this video and found this period in history both informative and enlightening. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope you can join us for another video. Thanks for watching.